I'm Anton Monsted, and I'm the head of soundtracks at Capital Music Group. In this series of conversations, I sit down each week with a screen composer and their closest collaborators to speak about the creative process that brings original scores to the screen. In today's conversation, I'm excited to welcome composer Benjamin Wallfisch. Ben has made an indelible mark on the film music landscape with defining scores for films including The Invisible Man, It and It Chapter 2, Shazam, and A Cure for Wellness. Ben has also collaborated with Hans Zimmer on music for 12 Years a Slave and Dunkirk, and together co-composed the music for Blade Runner 2049 and Hidden Figures, which is the film on which I met and first worked with Ben. Ben has invited his orchestrator David Krystal and his mix engineer Scott Michael Smith to join us today. Now today's recording runs a little longer than we're used to doing here, and when we were discussing how to approach this, Ben proposed a compelling framework through which to unpack and explore the different phases and the many individual roles that serve the creation of a film score, from an initial brief right through the writing, orchestration, recording, mixing, and delivery of that music. The resulting conversation is like a masterclass on the creative processes that underlie the creation of film music. I found Ben, David, and Scott all to have an infectious curiosity and passion for what they do, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to this as much as I have. It's my great pleasure to welcome Benjamin Wallfisch, David Krystal, and Scott Michael Smith. Ben, I would love to start our conversation with a little bit of your work history and how you got your start in film music.
I'm from the UK, and I was lucky enough to work with a fantastic Italian composer, Dario Marianelli, very early on in my work in film music. And I was his orchestrator, but more like his apprentice, I guess, from the age of about 22 to around 28. And during that time, I was also doing a lot of work in classical music as a conductor and writing concert music. And what was really interesting was how working with Dario, because he came from a similar place, I found so many parallels with what I was sort of most comfortable in. But I found this early passion I've always had for film music, which started from the age of maybe I guess the age of 5. 3 is a bit early. When I first heard E.T. And like so many kids, growing up in the 80s and being just so lucky to hear those scores for the first time as kids, I always found this allure of narrative music and how the raw power that comes from hearing an orchestra tell a story in that way, that spoke to me more than classical music, always. And I think working with Dario in those early days where I was orchestrating his music, conducting, and really just learning how he told a story with a melody and was treating dialogue like an instrument, and how much power you can get with very little when it comes to orchestration. All of those things fed into that process. And I think any young composer, it's so important to do an apprenticeship and learn from someone who really knows not just the music, but the craft and what it means to be a storyteller. And during that time when I was in London, I composed a score called Dear Wendy. It's actually how I met Dario. He heard the score and invited me to come on board with him. And then another score called The Escapist, that was in 2008. And my dear friend Hans Zimmer, at the time I was 28, 29, I was thinking about moving to Los Angeles, and he actually had heard that score, The Escapist, and reached out to me by email and said, hey, we should meet and talk. But he actually sent that email to the wrong email address, so I actually never got this email. He tells the story much better than me. It's actually a very funny story when he tells it. And it was around, I guess, 2009 when I was just turning 30. I was really just had fallen in love with Los Angeles. I'd come here in 2007 for the first time conducting the soloists for Dario, and just made so many friends so quickly and just immediately felt at home here. And I just needed to find a reason to move. And Hans and I have a mutual friend, dear friend called Richard Harvey, who's this incredible virtuoso composer and multi-instrumentalist. And I've known him for a long time, and I went out for lunch with him saying, hey, Richard, could you introduce me to Hans? And he said, well, I'm actually seeing him in a couple of weeks. I'll mention it. And this was just after Hans had sent me this email I never got. And then after this little meeting between Hans and Richard called me and said, hey, so Hans said he wrote to you and you never replied. What's going on? So that was the rather a roundabout where Hans and I connected, and that gave me a very good reason to move to Los Angeles. We didn't actually work together for a couple of years after that, and around that time I was just starting to get to know filmmakers. A very good friend of mine called Eric Heisserer, who invited me to score Hours, which is his first film as a director. He's a prolific screenwriter as well. And then Hans brought me into 12 Years a Slave, which was an incredible experience. And over the next sort of 5 or 6 years, Hans became my mentor. And during that time, I was, scoring indies and some smaller studio films, and building up relationships and just spending every hour I could with Hans and learning from him. And we ended up collaborating on some scores which for me were life changing, not just professionally but just creatively, and really just getting an insight into what it really means to be a film composer, which is that you are primarily a filmmaker, where you bring your musicianship into the to the table, but without having the insight of storytelling, and understanding what it means to make a film from that narrative point of view. It's quite hard to then apply that to musical storytelling. And Hans for me was he really is what he really turned on the light bulb for me on that front.
I think anybody who has a chance to be mentored in their chosen craft is a very lucky person, particularly when you talk about Hans. I'm sure that everybody listening is like, what could that be like? But I also know that these are learning experiences, and I love what you say about the storytelling aspect of this, because when it comes to employing film music in general, whether that's a song or whether that's score, everybody in that process is subject to the needs of the story. And what an incredible education you managed to get.
Well, it's a strange alchemy when you put music to an image, and just how powerful that can be. It's almost like you have to be really aware of how potent that is, so that when you're making decisions with a filmmaker about why a particular cue, which is just a section of the score, is going to come in exactly where it's going to come in, and the tone of it, and the orchestration and the color. It's a character. It's part of the narrative, which strangely you can almost, like, sometimes by doing too much you take away. It's about knowing what the balance is of how present the score should be, and really sort of getting inside the idea of a theme, which doesn't always have to be a melody. It can be a color, and so much of that is by different filmmakers have different ways of communicating that, and it's all about sort of reading between the lines and spending as much time with the filmmakers as you can to really get an insight into the sort of philosophy of what they're trying to achieve.
Before you can have collaboration, you have to have process, and filmmaking has a process that has evolved over the last 100 or so years. It's a process that has also developed as the technology's developed. If we could zoom in a little bit on collaboration in film music, and particularly your process and how you get from day one working on a film score through to delivery and final mix.
Writing a film score is, if you zoom right out, what you're actually doing is producing a recording of the music that you've written, and actually by doing that, and also you're doing it in circumstances where you often have to do it incredibly fast, and what you're composing to the movie itself is constantly changing, and not just in terms of the cut, which is always changing, but also in terms of what the direction might be, where you might have a discovery halfway through the process of a new theme or a new direction, which may completely change the philosophy of earlier. And you need to be incredibly agile, and the ability to change things and make them feel like it was always meant to be that way all along. There's a lot of process, and there's a big team involved as well. And it's something I love about being, writing music for film, being so heavily involved in this hugely collaborative art form of filmmaking, is every movie I try and subtly improve the process. And when I say the process, I'm really talking about 4 main steps. And there's actually, thinking about it, there's a real analog between the film scoring process and the overall process of making a movie. The script writing stage, the pre-production before they shoot, the production where they're shooting, and then obviously the post-production where they're editing the film, all the VFX, all the sound design, all comes together. So the first of those steps, which is the composing writing phase, very much, you can think of that like what it must be like to conceive of a story, of a script. And so that's really one of the most sort of solitary parts of the process, where I'll have been invited on board a movie. Now sometimes that happens towards the very end of the editing process, where I'd have maybe 6 to 8 weeks to write the whole score. Sometimes it happens a year before we record the score, where I'll be invited into the team before they've shot the movie, and that's always really exciting because I get invited to the set and meet the actors and meet the DOP and the production designers and costume designers, and really kind of start to absorb and drink in the overall tone and philosophy of the movie. And that's happening more and more these days, which I love. But then when you actually, you day one on the scoring process, that's when you spot the movie. And that's really where you sit down with the director and other filmmakers, sometimes editor, sometimes the producer, and you'll go through the movie really scene by scene and really get into the nuts and bolts of, I'm always asking the question, why? If we're going to put music to a particular scene, what's its purpose? What is it going to bring? And often with films, it's so interesting. Sometimes you end up with wall-to-wall music, and so then which I always embrace because it's quite exciting. Then it becomes about pacing and having a real sense of rhythm to the cues, and so that it's not just this kind of wallpaper, and also pacing. When the score is prominent in the mix, for example, when there's maybe no dialogue and the score is leading, what does that do to the overall structure of the music? And if you're making a big statement here, then you need to make another big statement maybe 5 minutes later, pacing it so that it doesn't become overloading. And there's lots of sort of very technical, like, you got to think very structurally in that way, and all those decisions are part of a big discussion with the director. And when we're spotting, the kinds of notes I'll be getting will be anything from, the notes which are most valuable to me is emotion and story, and talking to directors and trying to put myself in the position of, almost imagining I'm an actor and sort of what an actor might bring to a line. It's like how a particular choice musically. So long story short, there's a spotting process where we're discussing sort of philosophically what might be. Now, often what I try and bring to those spotting sessions is a suite of ideas. So I'll hopefully have read the script or maybe seen some rough footage or been on set, and I'll have gone away and written maybe 20 minutes of material, of some ideas, and maybe none of them stick, maybe some of them become the main theme, but it means that the conversation is immediately musical, because describing music in words is that famous quote, I can't remember who said it, but talking about music is like dancing about architecture. It's very true. And that's when an important tool that we have is temp score, and that's kind of where our first big collaborator, one of my first big collaborators comes in, which is the music editor. Now, often even before I start work, the music editor will have been involved with the director and the picture editor to craft the temp score. And the temp score is like it's what it is. It's a temporary score, and the purpose of it in the best case scenario is just for it to be a shorthand of tone, to sort of describe the feeling. But the best case scenario is when a director says, look, this is just a rough idea, just to, take it or leave it, and what it does is trigger a conversation. And sometimes the conversation is, well, that's interesting, but what if we did something the exact opposite of that? And here's why. And then you demonstrate it, and you'd be like, oh, that's a terrible idea, or that's interesting. Now why don't we try? And so you're sort of using sketches, and albeit from all kinds of different places to sort of be a trigger point for a conversation. Sometimes it goes in the other direction, and a filmmaker can become very attached to a temp score, and then that becomes a different kind of conversation, and then you have to, I will never rip a temp. It's about like trying to understand what is it about that particular piece of temp that is working, and it might just be the fact that it has a string orchestra. It might just be the tempo. It might just be the sort of the pacing, and there's certain things you can sort of then take that essential DNA and then turn it into something completely original, something completely new. So recently I just tend to just turn off the temp. I mean, certainly we'll talk about it during the spotting session, but when I'm writing, I'll never listen to it unless there's an exceptional case, and that often means that there's more adventure and there's more opportunity for happy accidents and discoveries. But anyway, just going back to the collaborative side, so music editor will be there in that pre-composing process, and then we will spot the movie. The music editor will be making spotting notes, and then I'll work with the music editor to really define what the structure of the score is, where the cues come. Sometimes a cue, which this little section of score, it can be 30 seconds, sometimes 8 minutes, 9 minutes, depending on what makes sense. Anyway, and then starts that process of writing, and that is really where it's about like creating the atmosphere of being in a band with your filmmakers. The director, sometimes the picture editor, sometimes other key creative filmmakers. Well, they're all creative, but the key players, producers. You'll all get in the room, and I'll play them demos. And the demos are digitally produced using samples. So there's this incredible. We have access to these beautiful recordings of an orchestra playing one note for 30 seconds at different velocities, and I feel for those poor musicians who had to sit there at Abbey Road recording that one note. But the result is that we can, on our computer, pull up these beautiful recordings and craft very realistic sounding demos. And that's kind of like, a combination, I guess, of the script writing stage plus the previs. So, before you go on set, you're going to work with previs artists to really understand like what's the camera move probably going to be and what's the blocking, and those demos allow that possibility where you haven't had the enormous expense of hiring a full orchestra, but you can work with the director in your studio, and they can really get into the weeds, and you can make decisions about, should this involve a flute solo or an oboe solo, or that's just a bad example, but you can get into that sort of detail so that by the time you actually record it with an orchestra, many of those big decisions have been made, and now it's all about the performance and the emotion of that performance. And the other part of it is, I mean, the music editor really is probably the main collaborator who is on board on every step of the process. As the cut is changing, they'll be feeding me conform notes. So when I'm doing a demo, it will be the synth demo plus a click track sent to the music editor, so they know exactly where the beats come. And then if there's a revision to the cut where, say, a certain scene has been reduced by 8 seconds and 12 frames or something, the music editor will then send me conform notes, which will tell me exactly how many beats or fractions of beats the change is. So I can then map that out musically speaking. And sometimes they'll make suggestions about, well, if you were to shorten this section by 8 beats and this section by 2.5, try that. And I'll try that, and actually, no, maybe something else. It just gives you a good starting point. And so the music editor is going to be heavily involved in that process of making sure I'm staying on top of and ahead of all of the picture editorial changes that are happening. So the music editor is like your right-hand man or right-hand woman during the scoring process and the writing process, and it's a really important collaboration. And so you finished doing your demos and you're up to date with all the conforms, and then there's this sort of final sign-off process where you're then going to present the score to the studio execs or producers or other people who haven't heard the score, and often you get an incredibly valuable insight. I've often had some, like a couple of 2 or 3 notes sometimes for an entire score, which can be very impactful from those guys. It's like a fresh pair of ears, and I love that kind of feedback can be super helpful. But again, it's like everything becomes very last minute because the fact that non-linear editing means that things can be changed so quickly and so easily that the cut that we are scoring to, sometimes we're not even given that till maybe 2 weeks or even less before our scoring period. So that means you need an incredible sort of Navy SEAL team to take all the demos, which have only ever existed in my computer, to the point where it can be performed by 100 musicians. And that process is the sort of pre-production, if we're going to make that analogy with the filmmaking process, the orchestration phase. And that to me is I'm particularly close to, because my first credits were orchestrating, and actually that process is kind of, there's two phases. There's the orchestration, which is the creative back and forth I'll have with David, who's my absolute genius orchestrator, and who I absolutely love. And also parallel to that, there'll be the scoring prep team, which is, it's the kind of part of the process which rarely gets spoken about, but it's absolutely essential. You've got to remember that when you're booking an orchestra, even if you have an amazing, you're lucky enough to have lots of time, 10 days, 12 days, and it's never enough time. And I say that with love. It's just because the minute you start that creative process, it's so exciting just in and of itself. You get more ideas, and a filmmaker might have more ideas, and you always want to accommodate that. So you need to maximize that time with the orchestra, and that's all about the prep. And so I really want to bring David into this soon, talk about the actual orchestration. But just to quickly say, whilst he's working on the scores, we will be prepping the Pro Tools sessions for the orchestra. Pro Tools is the recording software we use, and mixing as well, to make sure that for example, we'll get a score back from David and compare all the time signatures, the tempo with the click track, to make sure everything matches. And the scoring team who work here at my studio, they are absolute ninjas when it comes to preparing all the stems and just double checking everything, so it's whatever is given to the orchestra is perfect. Let's talk about the orchestration, and I'd love to bring David into the fray to talk about that in more detail.
I'd certainly love to hear a little bit about, David, how you and Ben have developed a workflow and a work process that is unique to your interaction. And what I get from everything Ben's saying is that there's a deeply creative aspect to this collaboration, and there's also a technical aspect.
I'd say the collaboration, as you said, it has definitely developed over time, and that's just from going back and forth and really me learning what his preferences are as far as orchestration, voicing, dynamics, etc. And it really was just a process of learning at first. We'd go back and forth a lot with the scores, so I'd learn his preferences, and really after a movie or two, I started to really get a sense of what he likes, and now it's just a lot quicker. I can go through a majority of the scores on the film, and Ben might have a day or two to glance at things and maybe tweak some things that he likes, but I know I'm going to be giving him in the ballpark what he wants, and if there are tweaks, they tend not to be big tweaks now. So it's a process that's developed both from us going back and forward with scores, but also from just me also being on the scoring stage with him, and really, being able to see how he tweaks things and being able to hear how things come out too. I'm always evolving my process to come up with more efficient and better ways to orchestrate. So that's really what makes it interesting. And Ben writes really interesting and challenging music, so that's what makes the job fun and keeps me interested on each one.
If I were Ben's orchestrator, I think I would feel a certain level of creative pressure knowing that that's something that was such a big part of Ben's evolution as a composer.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely pressure there, but at the same time, as I said, it's taken time to evolve the process. But I think what's also worked for us well is that I think we have a lot of similar tastes on things in classical music. I think we're both big Mahler fans and late Romantic music fans, so we've studied similar things and have similar tastes. So, I think naturally when I, for example, approached Ben's strings from the beginning, he liked what I was doing with it. So it was already kind of a pretty good fit, and then score after score, it just got better and better, and we've had some really cool chances to do creative things where we'll, for some of these horror movies, just come up with new effects and new textures to use, and that'll be a really collaborative process where we talk about creating unique sounds for each film, and that's really something interesting on the orchestration side that will kind of do prep work versus me just orchestrating straight from the MIDI.
I mean, that's what I love about working with David is he'll always bring super interesting and creative solutions to things which are sometimes just impossible to mock up, and it's a very technical process where I'll be sending him my MIDI files from my DAW, and we'll send him stems, but I know what David will come back will be elegant and interesting, and also very importantly practical. So if there's a particular moment in for example the strings where I'll put a huge melody in triple octaves, but then we want a driving accompaniment as well. It's often better to split that into two passes, or sometimes even three, and David's going to make those decisions and sometimes suggest things, and sometimes he does beautiful things like I might not have added a trombone section to the brass or something, just in the interest of getting the cue to a point where I can present it, but knowing that we're going to refine the detail when we orchestrate. He's going to add those things as suggestions. Unhelpfully, we call them cues inside of the cues.
Exactly.
That word is very overused in this whole process, but it's that kind of ease of back and forth, and like any great collaboration, I think of David almost like, I guess in the filmmaking he'd be like my DOP. He's gonna come up with really interesting solutions of how something might be framed, how something might be, the lighting, the execution of an idea, and we use software called Sibelius, which is one of the most powerful things about it is the way that it encourages collaboration. You can kind of put little sticky notes on a particular section, and just so David might say, "Hey, I've added this. What do you think?" Or, "The MIDI here was really unclear. What did you mean?" And it's sort of, we just do the whole thing over email. We almost never talk on the phone during that whole process, and it's become pretty quick, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like I said, I mean, I can go through most of the scores in the film without you looking at them, and then you'll spend, if you can spare it, a few days looking at them. But really, we just generally know what's going to be good. I generally know what you're going to like. So
yeah, I mean, it might also be worth talking about why we have an orchestration team. Why doesn't the composer orchestrate everything himself? And like everything with this whole filmmaking process, it's about time and, frankly, just enabling the director to have as many ideas as he wants, and accommodating the process so that if there are often very last minute changes, knowing that there's a scoring dates, I won't have the anxiety of like, how are we going to do that where there's no time, because I know that David or his orchestration team can accommodate it even day of the recording sessions. It will still happen, and it's one of the things I love the most about the scoring team is that it's just a bunch of these incredibly talented ninjas who will just stop at nothing to execute no matter what.
When you come onto the scoring stage and you see a 90-piece orchestra, your eye naturally goes to those musicians. But if you stop and look around, there's 10, 12, 15 other very hardworking people, all fulfilling a very specific role to the process. And you're laying out how we get to that day, because it's almost like getting to a wedding.
Right.
All this preparation goes in so that things can work perfectly on the day.
Yeah, it's to kind of create a situation where when you're with the orchestra and you have a 3-hour session, the conversations are 99% creative, and you're talking about performance and emotion, and you're not talking about why there aren't enough clicks in that bar, or hang on a sec, that doesn't make sense. And believe me, it's like I come from a place where, you know, when I was back in the UK and I didn't have a team, I'd have to literally do everything myself, and things do slip through because you're working through the night and it's just you, and you just start to kind of form a list of things like, you know, if I had someone helping me, what would they do? And that's kind of grown into something quite complex, and that team that you're talking about, it's a wonderful opportunity to call them out because these people are so talented and so good, and they often don't get enough of the limelight. It starts with my, you know, full-time crew here at the studio, the Scoring Lab, and my sort of right-hand woman, Caitlin Del Don, who's just an unbelievably talented woman, great pianist, but just an engineer. She loves the technical part of creating music, but she's also a great musician, and she's going to oversee auditing the score. And I say auditing, so for example, David will send a cue. So say it's a finished orchestration in a PDF file, and there might be like three string overdubs and a choir pass, and there may be some percussion, and we'll be recording the choir at the end of the whole scoring process, and the 3 string passes need to be distributed over 3 different sessions because you can't overdub the same orchestra on top of itself, and for very important reasons, to make sure it's fair for everyone. And so that means that the cue sort of needs to be analyzed so that, for example, if there's a string overdub in the middle of the cue, maybe the cue lasts 3 minutes, there's a string overdub in the middle that lasts 25 seconds. Now, I need to know when we're planning a recording session that there is that chunk of music that's 25 seconds long that will need to be recorded at some point. And I also want to know how difficult it is to play. So, for example, there may be like on day 5 or 6 of the session in the evening where everyone's a little bit tired, and you have 8 minutes left to a recording session. And so then I have a list of all the bits of music that we need to record that last a minute or less. But they'll be color coded. So I'll know this is really difficult to play or this is really easy to play. And so I'll put something that's difficult to play at the beginning of the day where people are fresh, and something that's easy to play at the end, obviously. But without having a musician, having gone through the score and made those judgments and organized it in that way, it's impossible to know, because otherwise you'll literally be like going through the score during the recording session with the orchestra waiting, trying to make decisions. So we do all of that prep work, and Caitlin and Alfredo Pascual, who's an incredibly talented engineer, who's our head of engineering here at the studio, he primarily is on the mix side, but he's also helping with that process. Our other assistant, Min Koat, who's an incredibly talented young guy who's just recently joined my team, he's helping with that process too. And that is all put into a Google Doc, color-coded with exact timings, difficulty, and also prominence in the score. Because, for example, if there are string harmonics which we can replace with a sample, and if we run out of recording time, I know that they can go right at the end, and that will be colored slightly different from a huge melody that has to be recorded. So if you have like a day or 2 to record a whole score, you can really organize yourself on the fly. Because remember, nothing goes to plan. Like, you can have a plan and you have to adapt. To just, there may be things that you just don't know will happen. Sometimes Pro Tools rigs crash it, or maybe there's a note from the director during the recording and you need to accommodate that. So planning is everything, and that's where this process of pre-production comes in. And then that same team will be present during the recording session, so that all of that prep work, they will know every detail, so that we can ask questions and get the answers quickly. But then the scoring crew. So these are the incredible people who are actually in the recording situation. So your scoring engineer, now you're going to have conversations with him about microphones and microphone placement, and you're also going to really lean on him to come up with solutions to, I really want to have like the violins play a lot of melodic stuff, and so they may say, well, let's put the violins opposite each other so we get a beautiful stereo effect. Or there's a very heavy dark element to the score, and so, well, let's put the bass section in the middle of the room so the sound blooms, and then we'll sometimes go through the demos together and say, well, I really think we should record the brass separately, so why don't we just split the strings from the brass. Those are conversations you're having with your scoring engineer, and then when you're obviously casting the musicians. So then you have your orchestra contractor, super important conversations you're going to have about what kind of score is it, and I don't want to, I never name musicians, but I'll give him kind of the type of music, and he will then go away and hire the musicians which he feels are going to bring. I mean, sometimes you want certain soloists and certain section leaders who have a real sound, and that's super important as well. You kind of cast the musicians in that way. But I love working with new people, and I'll always trust my contractor. And then, you have the Pro Tools recordist. So he's the guy who will be literally making sure that the right cue is being recorded, but he's also comping as we go. He'd be making take notes. So if I'm not conducting the orchestra, I'll be in the booth and I might say, hey, that take was great for this section. He's going to make a note of that so that when we come to actually edit the score together. So he's like one of the most hardest work person in the room, because we'll say, actually, let's just do the flute separate here, and then he has to make a whole new set of tracks very quickly because every second counts. And it's just the level of calm and zen from that desk is always very inspiring for me. That these guys are just amazing. And then I used to always conduct my own scores, but I found it's much more helpful now for me to be like a hybrid where I'll be in the booth primarily, so I can really hear what's being recorded, but also be next to the director and actually be able to get into conversations with him in a way where there's no, like, I'm actually in the same room as him. So I'll work with great musicians, conductors who will commandeer the orchestra, create a good atmosphere, and also perform the cues. And sometimes I'll go out there and conduct a little bit. Just it's quicker than just reading a list of dynamics. Just show it. I come from a conducting background, but I love also what certain conductors can bring, is unexpected things. And your concert master too. Important to call out the leaders. It's the first violin. They're kind of responsible for the bowings for the entire string section, and sometimes you'll delegate that to the different section leaders. Your second violin, your viola, your cello, your bass. Those section principals, they're going to translate all the various creative notes that we'll be giving to their sections, and also the principal wind and brass. And the other unbelievably important team in that recording booth is the copyists, the music prep. Now those are really like the Navy SEALs. These guys are unbelievable because we will be changing things on the fly all the time, right down to completely rewriting cues. I'll do it on my laptop on Sibelius, to just small things like, that tune, it would be so great if we could have it doubled in the trumpets. And by the time you've said, okay, here's the horn tune trumpets, can you write this down? It's in concert pitch. It takes about 3 minutes. The copying team will take 2 minutes to copy that horn part, transpose it, print it, take it out onto the recording stage, put it on the stand. They'll do that within normally 2 to 3 minutes. And I'm always in awe of this machine that they have. And it's also, I often find myself pushing it right to the edge where, poor Dave will be getting a cue like the day before we have to record it, and the copying team will be working through the night. But it's an amazing thing to see this unbelievable, this team that is just making things happen, all just to make it again so that it feels like a laboratory, that there's no idea is too audacious or too difficult to achieve. There's always a way of translating an idea from your filmmaker into reality, and that's why you have these unbelievably talented and experienced people just working with that shared sort of goal in mind. I'm hoping I haven't missed anyone out. I think that's pretty much everyone there. And of course you have the studio coordinator, you have the scoring coordinator who's there too, who's, they'll be responsible for making sure that the studio is booked, the right musicians are booked, and are you going into overtime, making sure that the budget, you're still on budget. And I'll sometimes say, hey, if we did 50 minutes overtime, what would we lose later? And we'll be having back and forth conversations about practical things like that all the time to make sure we stay on track and everything gets done efficiently.
It's such a balancing act. You've got 90 or 100 or more musicians waiting to play, and you've got a director who you're looking to say that's hitting it on the head, or it's not quite what I thought it was going to be.
So much of it is about the prep, and part of that prep is the demoing process, so that the creative conversations that you're having are like exciting ones rather than I didn't think it was going to be like that. I think we need to fix that. Like, you've already done that through the demoing with the synth demos and that whole so those kind of creative conversations are more like, wow, what if we were to try X? And sometimes I'll be like, well, okay, that's a cool idea. Let's squeeze that in at the end if we can. Or sometimes I'll be like, oh my god, that's absolutely brilliant. I'll always say yes though. There's always like, I always want to hear that from a filmmaker. More often than not, honestly, we've been through that process in such detail already. The scoring sessions are just like, it's like the after party. It's like, it's where you really, it's just fun and exciting and beautiful, because like the most important people in that room are the musicians and the orchestra. And it's about really giving them the best chance of shining. And that's about being incredibly organized.
If the stages leading up to the score recording are like the pre-production of a film, and then the score recording is like the shoot, what happens once you've committed all these performances to tape?
Well, that's the mix. And I would say that's much like, in the edit, that's kind of where the film is made. That's really where the score is made. That's where what the audience hears is crafted. And I mean, in many ways, the mix almost starts from when you start a demo. You're already making decisions about, about balance and about tone and color, and often elements from your demos will be in the final mix. If it's a heavily hybrid score or lots of synths, lots of percussion. So there's a kind of for me, it's the mix process is just as important as the writing process when it comes to the idea of composing a score. And like anything, you need great collaborators and also be very prepared, because unlike the editing process, in the picture editing process where there's often months, the score mix is often incredibly fast. Like, you're under an enormous time pressure because you'll have planned things out where you're backing into the final dub, which is where the music, the sound design, and the dialogue are all brought together and mixed by the re-recording mixers to the final sound which the audience hears. And over the years, I've pushed that gap between when you finish scoring to when the dub starts to as long as I can get, just so that often what happens is you're chasing the dub, so the dub will start in reel 1, and by day 4 they'll be in reel 3. You need to be way ahead of that, so that you never want the dub to be waiting for the score. That's like the worst possible scenario. So I try now to make sure that there's at least a week of mixing time before the dub starts, ideally 2 weeks, so that you can get way ahead. And that's because the mix process is very creative. That's where there are certain things which you tend to always call on. There's a certain sound I personally love. There's a certain way I like to record an orchestra and mix an orchestra. There's a certain intensity to that sound. But then every score requires something completely new. Like, I try and make a point of never trying to repeat myself, both in terms of the music, the notes, but also in terms of the production and the color. And so you kind of have to allow that time to discover what that is. And just being purely practical about it, over the years, I've working on indie movies, where there's very low budgets, I just made it a philosophy where I would spend all the money on the orchestra. There would never be anything left for the mix, and of course it has to be mixed. So the only logical outcome is that I had to learn how to mix my own scores, much to my agent's chagrin. Is he would never earn any money because you'd be given a package and there's the orchestra fee. It's like, dude, and so that's kind of like, I was very lucky early on to work with really such talented scoring engineers like Jake Jackson and other Rupert Coulson and just these amazing people in London, and they were generous enough to say, look, I know you can only afford to pay me for 2 days and you need 5. You can use my rig, you just do it. And they would give me the Pro Tools rig in their room, and I would just make the best I could of it. And over the years, I got more and more confident with that and learning from them. And then, so lucky to then, when I moved to LA, work with scoring engineers like Alan Morrison, who's an utter genius. And I've learned he's so generous with information and how just there's no barrier. And he's just a wonderful man. And I owe a lot to Alan and his insights. And many others. I'm. It's hard to name everyone, but in a way, once you go through that process of kind of mixing your own stuff and sometimes describing to a scoring engineer what you want and the sound, bearing in mind the whole process you've been on with the demos, it's sometimes faster just to do it yourself, and that sometimes caused some bust ups, and you're at 3 a.m. and you're like, you have to deliver reel 2 to the dub at 9 a.m. and it's like, oh my god, I need to go home and go to sleep. It's like, no, we got to get it right. And it's like this, and sometimes, like, over the years, I've found myself just going, you know what, it would be so much better if you divide it, so like you share a mix, and it's just for those purely practical reasons. And when I met Scott, it was really after I'd been through a process of mixing like 2 or 3 scores completely on my own, because I just hadn't found the guy who was sort of cool with that idea of sharing a mix. And I just had a very frank conversation with him. Look, like, I don't have time to mix all this. There's just no way, especially how do you feel about working in this way? And we have developed a really wonderful way of working together, which I'd love to, Scott, to bring it so I could give everyone a rest from my voice again. Just talk about that in more detail, and also the prep as well. But over to you, Scott.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny listening to Ben describe the process, and then just kind of pinching myself and having this realization of how much stuff leads up to when this stuff gets dropped in my lap. And, it's interesting because my role, as a mixer is all this stuff has happened, and you're kind of the last line of defense before this gets shipped off to the dub, and that's what's going to be in the movie. So I think with Ben, for years, he had, he has an idea in his head that he wants to get, and as he said, sometimes it's quicker for him to get there just to do it. And I couldn't imagine being in that situation where you're spending, a year of your life on this thing, and then you get down to this very condensed 2 to 3 week schedule, and you're working with someone, you're not relying on that person solely to try to get what you've been working towards for the past 12 months. It's frankly, like, from a creative sense, it's done all the time, but it's a little crazy when you think about it. It's like someone doing a really, really intense heart transplant surgery and then just calling in anybody, a decent, notable doctor to come finish it off for you, which is, so I understand. So yeah, when Ben and I started working together, we had this conversation of, he's kind of developed this style of how he finishes a project and mixes. And, I'm personally just someone who's game for any challenge. And if it's, okay, so we're going to do this completely different than maybe how I approach gig A or gig B, I'm all for it and down for it. So it's been great kind of getting into a place where we'll start a score and Ben will go through and, pick out the things that he really knows he needs to get under the hood on. And that saves me time to do a bunch of other things that he can let me go do. And often what we'll do is we'll have matched Pro Tools rigs. We'll be in different rooms, and we've got sessions on both drives, thanks to Ben's incredible team, which he's brought up, Kate and Alfredo, who have just been amazing. And so I can take a mix to 90%, and Ben can come in and listen and go, yeah, that's pretty good, but there are some things I'd like to change, or maybe, he wants to do more automation and I need to get onto something else. So we can kick it over into his room and Ben can finish it off, or vice versa. He can mix something and go kind of, what do you think of this? Have a listen. And I can pull up not just the mix, but the session and say, I think it'd be good if we made this tweak or that tweak, and we can do it together. So what's nice is I think it allows not only an efficiency, but it allows Ben to see his project through and through, so to say, and really be able to get to where he wants to go without it being leaving it to one person to be somewhat of a guessing game. And I think that's pretty unique. And personally, I love it because it's oftentimes it's, rounds and rounds of emails back and forth with revisions and notes. And with Ben, it's great because it's like, okay, let's just do X, Y, Z, whatever. You take this, finish it, we'll get there, and we're good to go.
It's critical in a way to embrace whatever the technology can offer, like at its most cutting edge. And I mean, the fact that like with David, we can have a back and forth with Sibelius files. It's all about just what is the fastest way to collaborate? What is the most efficient way to communicate an idea with your team? And with mixing, it can be so specific. Like there may be a certain frequency which is just poking out, which maybe one of us hears, one of us doesn't hear, but there's like, it just bothers me. And rather than just like saying, hey, there's this high mid thing, can you fix it? I can just go in there with my EQ and fix it. And that's like on a micro, but then on a macro level, there'll be a cue, which I know when I wrote it, that the sound will require when we go up to the big final mix. There's a certain attitude that's going to be needed, and that will have been fed into the orchestration, like the exact instructions that will be given to the orchestra, like that'll be fed into the way things have been split out. Like there's all these phases in the process which I've been privy to, and then but Scott may not have, because again, we only have 2 weeks, or if we're lucky, to mix a whole score. So then I'll just take that cue and just mix it, and then. And because we have matched rigs, like literally down to the exact plugins and the position of the speakers is identical, it will mean that when I send that to Scott, he'll give it a fresh pair of ears, and there'll be some really good insight there, and it's like using the technology to maximize the time. So like that's kind of the overarching philosophy here. Is like what is going to get us to creative conversations quicker than anything else, and how are the tools going to help us do that? And that's why I'd emphasize for composers who might be listening to this, the absolute critical importance of loving every department of the scoring process. And I say love because to really work at something in great detail, you need to love it, you need to be passionate, otherwise it's like you're going to find something else to do. And so I love Pro Tools as much as I love Cubase, and the difference, like the way Cubase handles MIDI versus the way Pro Tools handles audio. I love orchestration because of all the time I've been lucky enough to spend conducting orchestras away from film music, and I love the process of talking to a section leader and talking about bowings. I love voicing brass. I'm passionate about what reverbs we should do. I'm passionate about which microphones we should be employing and where and why, and trying something new. Like Scott and I had this little breakthrough a couple of years ago where we realized when we're mixing in 7.1, where in addition to the surround speakers behind you, have the mid speakers onto the side of you. And we were just using reverbs. But then we realized if we put two microphones, we have the wide mics, which is the far left, far right of the orchestra. If we had an additional pair of wide mics that were 6 feet higher and sent those only to the mid speakers, it kind of stretched the orchestra out in this beautiful way. And that comes out of a passion for geeking out, basically. And so what I'm saying is, like, it's important to really get into the weeds and understand what your team is doing in real detail, so to the point where you could do it. So that, because that means that you can then communicate to them really efficiently. You'll be on their level, and ultimately it's just about being as clear as possible. So that again, you're ultimately what you're doing is all of those conversations get filtered into this one place, which is what is the director's vision, what is the story, what are we trying to achieve with the music, and you then sort of that then becomes translated into this whole team of people to bring that to life.
This is a question that takes a step back from process and a step back from collaboration, and it's really to ask each of you whether there was a particular piece of film music or a particular moment that made you feel, I have to be a part of this work. This is the path for me.
I'd say, there have been a lot of scores that influenced me, but I'd say John Williams' score to the movie Hook, which I started listening to a lot in college, and also some of James Horner's works really, like his Star Trek scores, really inspired me to look into film music versus trying to pursue a more, traditional academic classical route. So yeah, I'd say it was really in college where I started to think seriously about film music.
David, you're not the first person to call out John Williams in this way.
No, really? I think especially on the orchestration side too, you'll find that a lot.
My answer is going to be a bit of a cop out because I initially started in the record world,
Right.
and film was not something I thought I would end up doing. It's something that just seemed too difficult, and the music seemed like almost too lofty for me to do something orchestral. You know, I wanted to work on indie rock records. So I kind of fell into it, which is a whole nother story. And what I ended up loving about it is, you know, my big influences as a mixer, as an engineer, are kind of classic headphone records, right? So it's the cliche but incredible Dark Side of the Moon. It's Kid A. We were talking about Radiohead earlier. Things like that. So records that were always to me very visual, where you could put on a set of headphones and you would almost, you know, you could easily imagine a soundscape to it. So for me, getting into film ended up being the perfect place without me knowing it. And when I started, you know, having the opportunity to work on my first handful of films, it was like, okay, hang on, the visual aspect that I love about music that doesn't have a visual to it is being fulfilled here. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily one score, although of course John Williams, I can think of quite a few Elmer Bernstein scores from movies I saw as a kid growing up that those melodies will never leave my head. But I'm kind of constantly being re-excited by just many different film scores and just seeing how things work to picture, because it's kind of scratching that itch of why I got into this in the first place.
I love that. It's great. Ben?
I mentioned it earlier, but it's just true. I mean, E.T., I think, had the biggest impact on me, where I guess I'm placing it now, I guess early 80s, I would have been about 5 or 6, so way too young to understand anything. I just knew that when I saw that movie, I'd never experienced such a powerful swell of emotion in that final act. Like, for example, the Adventures on Earth and the goodbye sequence. And I guess I think it was something about, I just started really trying to play the piano. My grandfather, Peter Wallfisch, was a pianist, and he was like probably the most important person in my life when I was a kid, other than my parents. I'd every weekend be with him, watching him practice, and such a warm man. And he the piano was like a friend, and I'd always play the piano. And that end credits cue, when you close on Elliot, cut to black, and then you hear that piano melody in D flat. And I just spent, as in a really rudimentary way, just constantly playing that cue back and back, trying to play it like much slower. And I obviously couldn't get near it. I was a kid, but it was something about the way the harmonies shifted and the chromaticism of it that was unlike anything I was learning. My piano teacher was giving me Hanon exercises and Beethoven and everything else to practice. That just excited me more than anything else. And I just had this vinyl of that album, which I just played literally to the point where I couldn't play it anymore. The grooves were just worn out, and just trying to, I guess it was more just like, I had a frustration. I didn't understand why I felt like the emotions that it triggered was so strong as a kid. And I felt the need to try and understand it. And I think that's the great thing about music, and you can say this about any great composer, from any period outside of film. There's something intangible where it will hit you just because it does, and you can spend your life studying and really getting inside the technical, the orchestration, the way the chord inversions work, the voice leading, everything else. But ultimately, you've got to tap into that fundamental, which is, how does it hit you emotionally? How does it make you feel? And that's what we're doing all the time in film music. And that's why we put narrative score underneath a dialogue scene. It's because we're creating that environment for the audience to experience the emotion of the story that much more powerfully. It's this sort of strange human experience that we all have in all cultures. It's a shared language of emotion. And I do remember E.T. as like my first sort of absolute being hit around the head with the power of that emotion, and spending years still trying to chase that feeling and trying to understand it and do it in my own way. And so, yeah, I think, and my wife was wonderful. For our wedding gift, she actually managed to get the great man himself to sign that album. But it was from the 80s, the vinyl, and I have that in a frame at my studio, just to remind me of that every day I walk past it.
Just to Ben's point on E.T., he's going to know this way better than I will, but there's a moment in that movie, which is maybe the perfect film score moment, which I think is the shot right before the famous bike flying in front of the moon, where there's this slight little slowing of the tempo right before this massive crescendo into this shot that's so iconic. And it's literally, you go back and watch that, and it just fills you with emotion, and it's just like everything that's magical about film score is kind of in those handful of frames.
Right. It's so interesting that you point that out, because I know exactly the point. There's like a close-up of the rifle.
Yeah.
And then there's like 3 jump cuts straight into E.T.'s face, like zoom cuts. And what he's doing there, because you've got to remember, John Williams is a jazz musician. He's using this crazy jazz chord. It's like a altered tritone substitution chord, just if you want to geek out. But he does it in this really kind of like weird chromatic moments. Like you think you're going somewhere, and then he does this kind of da 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 dum 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 da da da, and then you hit the harp, the soundos, and you don't know where the tempo's gone, and then he hits you with that melody. And even thinking about it, I feel emotional, because I can, it's so powerful. Like, and I think that's why I work with Scott. We we share that, and what's great about Scott is he brings that, because he came from the record business. He understands like how to produce a hybrid score. Like if we're talking about E.T. and that, just utter just genius of that music. I mean, really, I feel it's the perfect film score. But then we're about pushing boundaries. We don't want to look backwards. We want to break the rules. We want to try new things. And I think artists and EDM artists and people from all walks of music, they're constantly pushing boundaries, and we have to be aware of those things and embrace them in film music, because the stories are embracing those things too. And I think it's great to work with Scott and all my other collaborators, where we all just have this shared love of how eclectic music is, and when we know when something is great, no matter what the genre is.
It's an inspiring note to end on, and I mean, I just love hearing you guys get excited about the same stuff, and that's music and it's storytelling that brings us all together in this way. Ben, David, Scott, thank you very, very much for being part of this conversation today.
Thanks, Anton.
Thank you.
Real joy.
Thank you.
I've been speaking today with Benjamin Wallfisch, David Krystal, and Scott Michael Smith. Thanks for tuning in.